On Friday, in Dublin, Ireland, former UFC featherweight and lightweight champion Conor McGregor was held civilly liable for sexual assault of Nikita Hand by a jury of his peers. And we have been wondering what this means, what the information was, how do we better understand this trial? I had promised everyone on this channel I was going to speak to somebody who covered the case, who was Irish, who could give us some greater detail. So that's what we'll do today. Frank Greaney is my guest. Frank is a courtroom correspondent for Newstalk. He also did an entire podcast around this court case for the Irish Times. He attended every single day. He even spoke to Nikita Hand at, I believe, at various points, and has certainly an enormous amount of not just information and specifics about the trial, but about the broader context of sexual assault in Ireland and more. Ultimately, there is some distressing information here, and I cannot overemphasize, I encourage you to draw your own conclusions. I'll just say personally, cards on the table, I think after a conversation like this, I view what Nikita Hand did as a long and difficult search for justice. With that out of the way, it's time for a conversation with Frank Greaney. Frank Greaney, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Luke. Yeah, good to speak to you today.
Thank you so much. So there's so much to get to, but let's start piece by piece. And before we actually even get to the trial itself, can we speak a little bit more broadly about, to what extent you can, sexual assault in Ireland? Would you say that there is enough evidence to conclude that it is there are problems with reporting, or once it's reported, there's a lot of successful conviction of it? To what extent can someone, as an observer, look around, including relative to other peer nations in the area, and say sexual assault is identified and prosecuted in Ireland?
I think firstly, it's important to point out that there are cases that aren't taken lightly. They're very difficult to prosecute. The success rate isn't as high as maybe other criminal offenses. Clearly, for the most part, these cases are a he said, she said type of scenario. So I would ply my trade mostly in the criminal courts. You know, I would cover murder and rape trials day to day. And rape trials in particular, there are very strict rules around the identification of both the person making the complaint and the accused person. Now, this was a civil case, and maybe we'll get into the difference between the two in a little bit. But both Conor McGregor and Nikita Hand didn't have the same protection in terms of their anonymity that they would have had if these had been criminal proceedings. If these had been criminal proceedings, neither of them could have been identified. Clearly, the case would have still attracted an awful lot of attention, but we wouldn't have been able to report it in the same way. We wouldn't have been able to name and identify and use the images of Conor McGregor and Nikita Hand, nor would we have been allowed to put any detail into the mix that would lead somebody or lend somebody to identifying them. So this case was very different in terms of this taking place before the civil courts. There were none of those issues, and also the standard of proof when it comes to having a case heard before the civil courts is a lot lower than it would be in a criminal court.
So the fact that this was not that the individuals involved did not have anonymity certainly added an enormous amount to it. But rather than, I am focused on some of those factors, but I guess what I would ask is, how common is it for someone to not, an alleged victim, to not have criminal charges brought against their alleged perpetrator and then sue them in civil court relative to sexual assault? Is that at all something that you've seen before in any kind of degree?
In my experience, and I've been working in the courts for 10 years plus, I haven't come across a case like this. That's not to say that they don't happen and they're not common, but I suppose given the high profile of the person that the allegation was made against in this particular case, i.e. Conor McGregor, that was always going to attract an awful lot of attention. Whereas, you know, if you didn't have that level of profile, and I hate saying that, but that's just the world that we live in, I don't think the case would have attracted the same amount of attention. Also, you have to remember that, you know, while Nikita Hand was at pains to say that this wasn't about money, that it was about a vindication, clearly when you're bringing a civil case, you know, the only remedy that is available to the jury at the end is in relation to compensation. So more often than not, there's no point going after an accused person if they don't have the means to pay that compensation at the end. And also there is, in my experience, there is the added trauma of going through the legal process. So while people do have an avenue to pursue people in the civil courts, you know, it is rare enough that it happens in circumstances where a criminal case isn't brought, because I suppose and this is something that Nikita Hand and her legal team would have been mindful of. Clearly, it somewhat weakens your case if the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions here in Ireland, doesn't bring a prosecution, because they would spend some time reviewing all of the evidence in the case. Now, there are differences, fundamental differences in terms of the standard of proof. You're not comparing apples and oranges, but where a case isn't brought before the criminal courts because of a lack of evidence or insufficient evidence, as was the case here, I can see why a litigant would be reluctant to go down the civil route, because if they lose there, it can be a very, very expensive exercise for them.
Fair enough. Okay. Quickly, if we can, before we get into the specifics of the trial itself, it does seem like on this level, there is some similarity between the Irish and the American justice system, where in criminal cases, we have to do the burden of proof is reasonable doubt beyond that. And then, of course, in our civil cases, it's basically a preponderance of the evidence is something more likely than not. Is the Irish system similar to that one?
The very same. Yeah, the standard of proof is a very high standard of proof for criminal cases, for obvious reasons, I suppose, given the consequences for an accused person if they are found guilty, in terms of their freedom being taken away from them. So in criminal cases, it is beyond a reasonable doubt, very, very high threshold, where in civil courts, same in the US by the sounds of it, it is on the balance of probability. So where two versions of events are presented to a jury, as was the case here, Nikita Hand had one version of events, Conor McGregor had another. And when all was said and done and the evidence was presented to the jurors, they began their deliberations. And the standard of proof that they were working towards was essentially which version is more probable than the other. And clearly, having deliberated for 6 hours or so, they felt Nikita Hand's story was more probable, again, on that balance of probabilities.
So then let's start with some of the basics of the case. Who is Nikita Hand, and why was this case brought in the particular way that it was?
She is a 35-year-old hair colorist. At the time, back in December 2018 of these events, she was 29 years of age, essentially just starting out in her career. She was working in a salon in Dublin. She had and still has a young daughter. I think she was 7 years of age at the time. She was living with her then boyfriend in a house in Drimna, where she grew up, and that is also part of Dublin where Conor McGregor, as we all know, grew up too. And that's actually how they knew each other. Now, they didn't know each other very well, but obviously this is a very community-orientated part of Dublin where everybody knows everybody. So they would have known of each other. They would have moved in the same circles. In her evidence, Nikita Hand told the jury that she knew Dee Devlin, who is Conor McGregor's fiancée and the mother of his 4 children. So this is in the run-up to Christmas of 2018. She finished work at 4 o'clock. She and her colleagues were going out for their work Christmas party. They got ready in the salon. They had a few drinks there before moving on to an event not too far away from there. They went to a pub. More drinks were had. She was drinking beers. She admitted she had lots to drink, Bacardi and Coke. She had also taken some cocaine throughout the night. She was wearing a red jumpsuit that night, and she'd posted a photograph of it, of her on her night out wearing the red jumpsuit. And Conor McGregor responded privately. She followed him on Instagram. He didn't follow her, but was able to comment on this photograph, and he essentially asked her where she was. Conor McGregor was on his own night out with his pals, some of his mates from his gym, fellow MMA fighters, and also his friend James Lawrence, who was also on trial before the civil courts. Now, the jury didn't rule against him, and perhaps we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But in any event, they ended up in a nightclub. They were drinking until the early hours, and they left that nightclub at about 7 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of December 2018. Nikita Hand had kept the party going as well. She was back at the salon with her colleagues, where they were having drinks, listening to music, having a good time. And one by one, all of her colleagues started to go home as the night wore on. And in the end, it was just her and another girl that she worked with, a girl called Danielle Keeley, who also gave evidence before the High Court. And I suppose where their paths and their stories crossed, Conor McGregor and Nikita Hand, that is, there had been some contact throughout the night. Conor McGregor was in the company of another couple of girls in this nightclub. He wanted to go partying with them. They wanted to go home. So they got dropped off home. And Conor McGregor ended up on his own driving around Dublin with a member of his security team at the steering wheel. And he ended up going out by arrangement with Nikita Hand to that salon, picked them up at about 10 o'clock in the morning. From there, they spent a couple of hours driving around Dublin, all in good form, all having drinks in the back of the car. Music was being played. They picked up his pal, James Lawrence. Conor McGregor said that he went into James's house and he essentially said to him, look, I have two beautiful ladies outside. Let's go and party. They want to party. James Lawrence joined them and they ended up in the penthouse suite of a hotel in Dublin. That hotel, we heard, had been booked by on Conor McGregor's instructions by a member of his security team at about 4:30 in the morning. So this was many hours before he met Nikita Hand. And when he was asked during the trial why he would book a hotel room like that, he said it was he liked to rest after a night out. He liked to get up. He liked to shower in a hotel, work out in the morning. It was essentially to save him having to make that extra journey to go home. Now, Conor McGregor lived maybe 20, 30-minute drive away from where that hotel was. But in any event, they ended up in that hotel, the four of them: Conor McGregor, Nikita Hand, Danielle Keeley, and also James Lawrence and a number of members of his security team. And I suppose everyone was aligned in terms of the narrative and the story and the events of what led up to them arriving at that hotel at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And the business of the jury when it came to their deliberations was what happened thereafter.
Okay, so that brings us to essentially what happened thereafter. So I have a few things I want to go into, but I guess it makes the most sense to keep proceeding. Tell us how Nikita Hand alleges the night progressed from there.
Well, her story was that they were all sitting around the living room area of this penthouse suite. Drinks were brought to the room, vodka, Bacardi, mixers, beers. Again, everyone having a good time. Now, she said at one point she walked into one of the bedrooms and Conor McGregor was using the toilet and turned around and propositioned her. And she didn't think too much of it. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Left the room, ended up alone in the room with him again a short time later. And this is where she claimed that she was raped. And essentially what she told the jury in her evidence was that Conor McGregor made advances, that she resisted. She had a boyfriend at home. She wasn't interested. As it turns out, she told the jury she was on her period. She had a tampon in. So even if she was interested in having sex that night, which she said that she wasn't, she said she wouldn't have given the circumstances. And also that there was that connection with Conor McGregor's fiance, Dee Devlin. So she didn't feel comfortable with what was going on. And she essentially pushed him away, thwarted his advances, I think was how she put it in her evidence. And she said that Conor McGregor refused to take no for an answer, that he started kissing her, rubbing her face, pushed her onto the bed, told her to relax, and pinned her at one point on the bed. And she said that she was resisting. She put her two hands up in front of her, trying to fight him off. And during the course of doing that, she said that she felt the full weight of his body coming down on top of her. And she was wearing a Michael Kors watch that she resulted in her scraping her breast, quite a nasty gash on her breast as a result of that. And she said that happened during the rape. She described then how she started to bite him. She said the only part of her body that she could freely move was her head. So she said her only line of defense was to bite him. And she said that she bit him hard and that he didn't like that. And that when she did that, he flipped her around and then grabbed her in a chokehold from behind. And she described how he choked her 3 times. And while he was doing that, she claims that he said, "Now you know how I felt in the octagon when I had tapped out 3 times." And that was a reference, the jury was told, to the fact that he had lost one of the biggest fights of his career just 2 months later against Khabib. We all know what happened there and we know how he lost that fight. Now, interestingly, when that was put to Conor McGregor under cross-examination, he said, look, everybody knows who I am. I don't speak about defeats. I don't speak about fights that I'd lost. So he denied saying that. But Nikita Hand, in her version of events, was adamant that he had said that. And while he was choking her for the 3rd time, she said that she really thought she was going to die, that she was thinking of her daughter, that she was looking at the bedpost and she was thinking, how am I going to survive this? And she said at that point, she just submitted to him and whatever was going to happen. And she said it was that point that he raped her. Afterwards, she said then she described how somehow they fell asleep together And when she woke up, she said she was in a panic. She didn't know what time it was. Conor McGregor's watch, who the jury heard earlier, he had apparently been boasting about, and that caused a bit of friction between him and her friend Danielle Keeley in the back of the house. But as it turns out, that watch didn't actually tell time. It didn't work. And so he couldn't tell her what the time was, according to Nikita. Her own watch wasn't working either. So she scrambled around looking for her phone to get in touch with her boyfriend. Now, as the hours went on, and again, there were differing versions in relation to all of this. But in Nikita Hand's version of events, she said that she was very confused because everybody seemed to be leaving at this point, and she wanted the party to keep going. She was, trying to convince everybody to stay and have drinks. This was just after 6 o'clock in the evening. We know that Conor McGregor left, and he left with Danielle Keeley, and his driver brought them both home separately, and that she then stayed on in the hotel with his friend James Lawrence for the next 4 hours or so. They were seen leaving the hotel, getting into a waiting taxi a little after 10 o'clock that night. Now, James Lawrence, in his statement to the Gardaí, the police here in Ireland, he claimed that after Conor McGregor had left the hotel, he and Nikita Hand had consensual sex on 2 occasions. She flatly denied that. In fact, the first time that was mentioned to her was after, or the first time that she realized that that was an allegation that was being made, or claim that was being made, was after he said to the Gardaí. She said that she had absolutely no memory of it. She said she didn't find James Lawrence attractive at all. She said that she wouldn't have had sex with him. And she also sued him for damages in relation to that. But as I said earlier, the jury didn't find in her favor in relation to him. So Nikita Hand's version then was that things started to come back to her that evening, that in the hours before, or in the hours that she was seen on CCTV footage coming in and out of the lift in the hotel and being in the underground basement, seemingly very lovey-dovey with James Lawrence, and indeed giving Conor McGregor a hug and a little peck on the back of the arm as he was leaving. And this would have been after she claimed that she had been battered and subjected to this brutal rape. She said she had no memory of that. And her case was that she was in delayed shock. She has since been diagnosed with suffering from severe PTSD. But clearly all of that was being challenged by the other side, by Mr. McGregor, when he gave his evidence over the course of a couple of days. And then, as I said earlier, it was up to the jury to decide which version of events they felt was more probable to be the truthful one.
Okay. You were in the courtroom to cover this trial, so some of the stuff we can get a description of, but we cannot have access to see ourselves. Namely, my understanding is there were photographic evidence once she had decided to go to law enforcement, and there you can see all of the bruising. For those of us who cannot see these photographs, could you describe the extent and nature of the bruising that you saw in those photographs?
They were horrific, extensive injuries. There was a very experienced paramedic who gave evidence to the jury of bringing Nikita Hand by ambulance to a sexual assault treatment unit at a hospital in Dublin. And she said in all her years working as a paramedic, she had never seen bruising as intense as the bruising that was on Nikita Hand. We saw the photographs. The jurors were shown the photographs. Nikita Hand was black and blue from head to toe. The photographs were very, very difficult to look at for me as a seasoned journalist who covers murder and rape trials in the criminal courts day to day. They were a very, very difficult thing to look at. You would have to assume it was very difficult for the juries to look at them too. We also heard evidence, and she was very concerned about a tampon that was still inside her, that had been wedged right up to the top of her vagina. And we heard from a doctor in the hospital who had to remove that with some difficulty, with some forceps. She was very distressed. There was some CCTV footage shown of her in the back of the ambulance as she was being brought to that sexual assault treatment unit. She could barely lie down. She could barely sit down. She was in a lot of pain. She was very uncomfortable. She was distressed, clearly very upset in that footage. She required the assistance of a wheelchair to get into the hospital. Those were the physical injuries that the jurors would have to consider. Clearly, I suppose, given the sanctity, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States, given the sanctity of the jury room, we don't know how they arrived at their decision on Friday. But certainly, I think those photographs and the medical evidence that was heard during the trial would have been at the fore of their minds, in my opinion, because whenever seeds of doubt were raised in this case, I kept coming back to those. This was the next morning. She didn't want to press charges initially. Indeed, she didn't go to the Gardaí and make a formal complaint until close to a month later. But the Gardaí did speak to her in the hospital about what happened. She refused to name her attacker. She refused to tell her boyfriend who the attacker was. To the people who she had confided in, she asked them to delete messages, to delete photographs. A friend of hers had taken photographs of her injuries that night when she called over to tell her what happened before she went home to her boyfriend and her daughter. She was in a very distressed state, according to her friend, who did give evidence before at the High Court as well. So, they were very, very hard to look at. And aside from the physical injuries, she had also suffered significant psychological injuries. As I mentioned, she'd been diagnosed with severe PTSD. She had suffered with anxiety and bouts of depression before all of this happened, and that exacerbated all of that. So she is still requiring ongoing treatment and counseling as a result of what happened to her in that hotel.
Again, having been unable to see these things, it's a little hard to parse some of this. So it sounds to me like this is something that I can't say this, actually. I was going to say maybe this would have gone more forward with criminal charges in the United States, but that's hard to know as well. I guess what I would ask is, when you see something like that and then there are no criminal charges brought, how can we understand that? It seems like there would be I'm not going to call it a forensic slam dunk, but certainly very strong evidence that a very bad incident happened here.
Yeah, well, look, in terms of the forensic evidence, I mean, it was clear that Conor McGregor and Nikita Hand did have sexual relations that evening, that there was some sexual activity. There was a forensic scientist who gave evidence about DNA samples that she had tested and that were a match for Conor McGregor. But I suppose what's important to remember is that a forensic scientist giving that evidence can't give any sort of opinion as to whether that sexual activity was consensual or otherwise. So in Ireland, the independent body that will decide whether or not criminal charges are brought and prosecutions are carried out is the Director of Public Prosecution. So what happened in this case, and it's the same with every other criminal case in this country, is the Gardaí, our police force, would have investigated the complaint after Nikita Hand made it formally. They interviewed Conor McGregor. I think there were 4 interviews. He made some prepared statements or in consultation with his solicitors where he flatly denied the allegations. They would have harvested all the CCTV footage that they could to try and piece together a timeline in relation to events. They would have obviously had the medical evidence and all of that. Once they're finished their investigation, then the Gardaí hand that file over to the Director of Public Prosecutions, and it is essentially out of the investigations team then at that point. The DPP will review the case, and it is by case. They will look at its merits. But what they're really looking at is whether or not there is a reasonable prospect of a conviction. And they don't take cases until it meets that threshold. Not every allegation is pursued through the courts here in Ireland. I'm sure it's the same in the United States and elsewhere. And that was something that was very, very difficult for Nikita Hand to accept and to understand. Now, it's only in recent years that this office, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, has to give a complainant reasoning as to why prosecutions aren't brought forward. In the past, it was just a case of yay or nay, but now they do have to explain their reasoning to a certain degree. And they did that. We heard that she was sent some correspondence from the office. But even when they told her that simply there was insufficient evidence to bring a prosecution, Nikita Hand wasn't happy with the reasoning that she was giving. And she suspected that the reason that that a criminal prosecution wasn't brought was because of the person that she was making the allegations against, i.e. Conor McGregor, one of the most well-known sports people in the world. And she was assured in a follow-up letter from the DPP that that wasn't the case. We heard that the director herself actually carried out a full review of the original decision not to bring criminal charges, and the DPP was satisfied, having looked at the file again, having taken a second look at everything. And Nikita Hand did get a lot more detail, I suppose, as to why criminal charges weren't brought. And they felt that it was difficult to corroborate her version of events. The evidence or the statement that was made by Conor McGregor's friend, James Lawrence, who claimed again that he had consensual sex with Nikita Hand, twice after Conor McGregor had left the hotel. So this would have been in the hours after she had claimed that Conor McGregor raped her in the penthouse suite. And the DPP felt that it was very difficult with that statement in the mix. It would be very difficult to get a conviction across the line. Her behavior, which was described as odd in the CCTV footage, where she's seen putting her arms around Conor McGregor as he's leaving the hotel, giving him a little peck on the back of the arm. You know, the DPP would have asked themselves, like, will a jury find that this complainant's story is the truthful version of events? And again, it has that higher standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that's really the crux of the issue when it comes to the lack of a criminal prosecution being brought, was the DPP didn't feel that they would be able to pass that very high threshold in terms of convincing a jury in a criminal court beyond a reasonable doubt that Conor McGregor had raped her in that hotel room. And that's why criminal charges weren't brought. And she was assured that it wasn't because of the identity of the suspect. Now, it's important to also point out that Conor McGregor and his legal team seem to try and portray Nikita Hand as a gold digger. So in paperwork that was submitted to the court before this trial got underway, they were essentially describing her claim as an act of extortion. And that was because of the sums of money that she was looking for: €750,000 for rehousing, €1 million in loss of earnings, past and future. So, you know, 1.7 odd million euro was what she was looking for. And their side claimed that this was malicious, that this was a made up story just to get money out of Conor McGregor. But I think it's really important, and the jury was told this, that it's really important to point out that Nikita Hand didn't pursue these civil proceedings until the DPP had told her that they wouldn't be pursuing criminal proceedings. So that was her first port of call. When that door was closed for her, she went down another avenue because she wanted her vindication. She wanted to be believed. And that's what set in train the sequence of events that led to that jury coming back, ruling in her favor, ruling against Conor McGregor on Friday evening.
In your experience covering criminal trials in Ireland, let me back up a step. There is a presumption, I think, whether it is based out of information that is accurate or just an assessment from pop culture, that when someone suffers a horrific crime that Nikita has alleged has happened, that they, once it is concluded, if they're alive, they run out of there like the building is on fire. Mm-hmm. And so you're pointing out that there was the CCTV footage that, in the case of McGregor's defense, they had pointed at, and of course the DPP as well, that there is something I think they would allege is unusual here. So my question is this: are there typical ways people react when they become victims of sexual assault in the immediate aftermath?
I'm really glad you've asked the question, because the answer is, and as I say, I've over a decade experience covering cases involving sexual violence, and no two cases are the same. And what you've described there, a complainant or a survivor of sexual violence bursting out of a hotel room or otherwise, arms flailing in various states of undress, screaming help and crying rape, that's for the movies, that's Hollywood. In reality, that rarely happens, if at all. More often than not, in my experience, a person who finds themselves in that situation does what any other human being would do, and they just try and survive it. They try and cope it. They try and get through it. Nikita Hand described how she felt like Conor McGregor was going to kill her. And that was her evidence before the jury. She was being choked. She was breathless. She thought she'd never see her daughter again. You know, even if she wanted to run down the corridor and raise the alarm, which she clearly didn't do, and that was the evidence. I mean, she had an MMA fighter, a UFC champion, one of the greatest champions the sport has ever known, pinning her down on the bed. She said she had an out-of-body experience where she just let whatever was going to happen because she went into survival mode. And then what happened afterwards, look, it wasn't like, looking at it objectively, if you didn't know the background to the case, and if you were asked to take a look at that footage, and if you were to look at that group, and if you were to ask somebody, which one of that group has been subjected to a brutal rape at the hands of an MMA fighter just a few hours beforehand, you are unlikely to point to Nikita Hand, because she was seen with drinks in her hand. She was seen hanging out of the likes of James Lawrence, giving Conor McGregor that hug and that little peck that I spoke of, trying to convince people to stay, making phone calls, lying to her boyfriend about her whereabouts and who she was, or who she was with. She wanted to keep the party going. But that can all be explained in the very simple reality that in these situations, people often suffer from what's called delayed shock. And it was in the hours afterwards. And also, let's not forget, there's no escaping the fact that, she had a lot of drink on board and a lot of cocaine was taken throughout the course of the day. She had been up all night partying as well. That would have fed into the delayed shock. At least that's what the jury was told. And it was only then, as the hours went by and the effects of the alcohol and the drugs started to wear off, and things started to come back to her. And she had shared that, she said, with James Lawrence when she became very upset in the hotel. And while her recollection of every little matter and every little detail wasn't 100% accurate all of the time, and there were inconsistencies at times, and clearly Conor McGregor's defence barristers would have aimed to exploit those and to point those out to the jury in no uncertain terms. I mean, in my experience covering these types of case, there's rarely a situation where somebody remembers every little detail perfectly, and then it's because of that trauma. Nikita Hand went to see one of the most renowned and well-known psychiatrists in this country, a woman called Dr. Ann Leader, and she diagnosed her as suffering from severe PTSD. You don't get diagnosed with severe PTSD unless you have suffered a significant trauma, which Nikita Hand, I think is fair to say, did in the penthouse suite in the Beacon Hotel back in December of 2018. So, to sum it up, like in my experience, no two cases are the same, obviously, but in my experience, it's very uncommon that you would see somebody running out the door, arms flailing, looking for help, dialing 999, looking for assistance. It's rare that it happens.
I'm going to ask this question only in the interest of due diligence and to make sure that the audience gets as much information to make an informed decision about as possible. Could you explain what McGregor's team identified as various inconsistencies in Nikita Hand's stories and to what extent they were relevant?
They made like, look, they would have described a lot of what the other side was saying as noise, and the same charge was put to the defense. Nikita Hand's barristers and her legal team would have told the jury on day one that this was actually a very simple case that may look like a complicated one, and that everything surrounding the facts, the 5 or 6, it could be summed up in 5 or 6 sentences, and everything else is just noise to distract. Her side would have accused their barristers of trying to throw as much dust in the eyes of the jurors. A lot was made of lies that she told to her boyfriend. As I mentioned, she, at the time, her boyfriend, they owned a house together in Drimna with their young daughter. And she was out at her Christmas party. And at various points, and she did accept this, she didn't try and shy away from it. She did lie to her boyfriend about where she was going, who she was with. And what happened? We heard that when she came back to her home in the early hours of the following morning, her boyfriend had actually secretly recorded the conversation that she had. She told him that she had been attacked, that she had been raped. There were inconsistencies in that account. And also there were lies that were told. And she would have admitted to the jurors that she did tell lies. She lied about her whereabouts. She claimed that she was in another hotel in Dublin city centre when she was in fact in the Beacon Hotel. Now, in relation to that, she told the jurors that, she thought that she was in that hotel because of the interior of the room. She'd been in that hotel before, so she thought that's where she was. Whereas Conor McGregor's barristers were saying the reason she had referenced that hotel was to turn attention away from the Beacon Hotel, because she was worried that the CCTV footage that was eventually harvested wouldn't support her claim that she had been raped by Conor McGregor during the few hours that they were all there partying. There was also the evidence of her friend, Danielle Keeley, who gave evidence to the jury of not hearing or seeing anything that would suggest that Nikita Hand had been raped in that room. At no point did she seem distressed. At no point did she seem upset. She also gave evidence of Nikita Hand trying to get everyone to stay as she and Conor McGregor were leaving the hotel. I suppose what the jurors were being asked was, are they the actions of somebody who has been brutally and savagely raped by Conor McGregor? There was also talk of a phone call that she made to Conor McGregor, a very short phone call shortly after he had left the hotel. Now, she couldn't remember making that call, and she couldn't remember an awful lot about the hours after Conor McGregor had left. But again, the jury was being asked, why is she calling Conor McGregor if this is the man that she will go on to accuse of raping her? Now, I think it's clear, and the jurors would have been allowed to infer that the reason that she was calling him was because she and James Lawrence had essentially been locked out of the penthouse suite. We saw them both going up and down in the lift, but not able to get access to the penthouse suite. So clearly Conor McGregor, having booked the room, needed to give them that access, but that was obviously a matter for the jurors to consider. So there was all of that evidence, and also something that muddied the waters in terms of deliberations was the evidence of Conor McGregor's friend James Lawrence, because James Lawrence described the hours after Conor McGregor left, and he essentially told the jurors that Nikita Hand was trying it on with him, that he wasn't interested, that he batted her away a number of times, but that he eventually relented, and they ended up having what he described as fully consensual sex twice. Now, there was no evidence to suggest that forensically that they had had any sexual interactions, but he said that he had worn a condom, so it's not that unusual that if it had happened, that there wouldn't be any forensic traces of it. So that, from the defense's point of view, there was a lot of evidence that I suppose was raising question marks and raising doubts in relation to the narrative that Nikita Hand was giving. But again, she accepted that her behavior after Conor McGregor, after the rape had taken place, she accepted that it was bizarre, that it was odd, that it was out of character. She got very upset when she was watching the CCTV footage of her in the lift with James Lawrence, because she said it was like looking at somebody else. It was like looking at a different person. She didn't remember it. And that was the evidence that she gave. And she was accused of having selective amnesia as well, of like remembering specifics about the rape, but not details that would actually work in favor of the other side. And again, that's something that the jurors would have had to wrestle with. Conor McGregor would say that his story didn't change from the moment that he went into the Gardaí and gave them what was a prepared statement, a statement that was prepared with his solicitors. But the jurors also heard, despite his claim that he wanted every shred of evidence to be put before the court, the jurors were also told that in the 100 plus follow-up questions that he was asked by detectives investigating this case after making his statement, not once did he make a comment, as is his right. And the jurors were told that they can't make any adverse inferences into the fact that he answered no comment to the 100 plus questions that they asked him after he prepared those statements. But there was also a claim from her side that there was an element of collusion in this case, that Conor McGregor and his friend, the second named defendant, James Lawrence, had essentially concocted a story, made up a version of events so that they could get away and that they wouldn't be found of any wrongdoing. Now, clearly both of them would have denied that. We know the jury didn't find in her favor in relation to James Lawrence, but they did find in favor of her in terms of the case that she was making against Conor McGregor.
So ultimately, she was awarded approximately $250,000 US, give or take. Why were the damages? Explain the damages. As you mentioned, she was given nothing related to the James Lawrence situation. She was related to Conor, but even then, not the full breadth of what she'd wanted against Conor relative to what she was asking. How did they end up with $250,000 approximately?
Well, exactly how they ended up with that figure, we don't know. Again, that was something for the jurors and the jurors alone to assess and award. And, again, given the sanctity of the jury room, we don't know how they arrived at that number. It was just shy of €250,000, as you say. Now, Nikita Hand, we heard at the outset of this trial, was looking for €750,000 for rehousing. And the reason for that, and the jury didn't hear this because the judge wouldn't allow it, he felt that it was irrelevant, but I'm sure the jurors have read and heard about it since. The reason she was seeking €750,000 for rehousing was because she had to move out of her home and her hometown because of what she felt was intimidation around this case. So the judge was told about an incident that happened in June of this year, so just in the summer just gone, where her home was broken into, window was smashed in, a number of masked men came in. She was in bed with her current partner, who was in court throughout the past couple of weeks with her. We heard that he was stabbed. Her daughter, now 12 years of age, was sleeping in an adjoining room. The Gardaí were called, and she felt that she could no longer stay in that house. She no longer felt safe in that house. She felt like she had to move out of her hometown as a result of all that. And that's why she was looking for €750,000 for rehousing. Now, it is really, really important to point out, and this was also said to the judge in the absence of the jury, that her side weren't laying the blame of this at the feet of Conor McGregor, but they did tell the juror that those responsible for that were supporters of Conor McGregor, and they said that their claim was that it was a targeted attack as well. So the judge considered that evidence. They wanted to put it to the jury. He didn't allow it. Now, aside from that 750 grand, she was also looking for €1 million in loss of earnings. And there was evidence heard in relation to that. Nikita Hand was starting out in her career, 29 years of age. She was a hair colorist. She was ambitious. She had dreams of opening up her own salon. But because of the PTSD that she suffered, and because she finds the work that she does, and particularly customer-facing roles, triggering for her, she made a number of attempts to return to that career, but was unsuccessful, and she feels like she'll never be able to return to it. So there was evidence heard in relation to that calculation. So that's a little over €1.7 million that she was looking for. And while €250,000 is still a hell of a lot of money, whatever way you look at it, it's nowhere near what she was looking for. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because they didn't go and award her damages above and beyond. So the jurors were asked to consider 4 different categories of damages: general, special, aggravated, and punitive. And they only awarded her damages in relation to the first 2, general and special. That would be things that are quite easily calculated, and that they would have heard evidence in relation to things like medical bills, counseling. She's had to get an awful lot of counseling as a result of what happened to her in the Beacon Hotel at the hands of Conor McGregor. So, these are all things that she would have receipts for, that she would be able to account for, and also loss of earnings. Now, clearly she didn't get what she was looking for. She was looking for €1 million in loss of earnings. She got significantly less than that. I think the breakdown was 60 grand in relation to general damages, and the rest then for special. But when the jurors assessed whether or not aggravated and punitive damages should be awarded, they decided not to award damages in relation to those 2 categories. And those 2 categories would take in things like how a defendant like Conor McGregor approached the case, their behavior in the aftermath, whether there was, in general terms, an attempt to assassinate a person's character, whether lies were told, whether there was collusion. And the jurors in civil cases in Ireland can also consider punitive damages, which will go even beyond that and send out a message to society as a whole that this type of wrongdoing is not acceptable, and they can put a price on that too. And they would have been given a lot more detail in relation to how they go about assessing those damages by the judge before they began their deliberations. And the longer the deliberations went on for, the more I felt that they were going to rule in their favour in relation to the complaint against Conor McGregor, because if they had found against her in relation to that, they clearly wouldn't have had to assess damages. So I suspect a lot of the time in the jury room was spent working out those calculations, but in the end, clearly an awful lot less than she was suing for. But Nikita Hand will say that this wasn't about money. This is about vindication. And I think that is really important to point out. She wanted to be believed. She wanted to get her story out there because that was how she felt it was the only way that she could go on and live a full life. Clearly, she was very disappointed and shocked when the DPP didn't bring those criminal charges. So she felt this was her only avenue towards vindication.
How has the country of Ireland received both Nikita Hand and Conor McGregor throughout this trial?
Well, certainly since the verdict came in on Friday, Nikita Hand has been embraced by the whole country, it seems, with warm, open arms. She is a remarkably brave woman to have brought the allegation in the first instance and to have kept going, particularly after that bitter disappointment when criminal charges were not brought. Because as we spoke about at the beginning of this piece, unlike in criminal proceedings, she, throughout the past couple of weeks in relation to these proceedings, wasn't afforded the same protection when it comes to her identity. If these were criminal proceedings, her identity would have been protected throughout and forever if that was her wish. But with civil proceedings, she doesn't have the same protection. So she was photographed every day. Her name and her image were splashed all over the papers, spoken of ad nauseum throughout the trial, clearly, as you can imagine. And this wasn't a story that just attracted headlines and coverage here in Ireland. 20 plus journalists in the press bench every day. This case attracted international attention. Conor McGregor, on the other hand, I mean, Conor McGregor, even before this trial began, is a very divisive character in this country, and you would argue elsewhere. I mean, when Conor McGregor first broke onto the scene as this incredible fighter and athlete and this larger than life personality, I know a lot of people in this country were very proud of what he was achieving on the world stage in a very, very difficult arena. And Conor McGregor, as we all know, wears his Irishness on his sleeve. He is a very, very proud Irish man. He comes from a very disadvantaged part of town, where he wouldn't have had the same opportunities that others would have. And he's spoken ad nauseum about how he worked hard to get out of that. Like, it is a real rags to riches story. And at the beginning of that journey, and as he was, I suppose, rising to the top of his game, he was loved and adored by all, and even though, like, he had that larger than life character mocking opponents and whatnot, it was all part of, we felt, the pantomime surrounding Conor McGregor. And there is a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And I think it's fair to say that Conor McGregor rarely walks the line in relation to that. But over the past few years, I think people's opinions of Conor McGregor here in Ireland have changed somewhat. He had the potential to be such a positive role model for so many, and given, for whatever reason, his behavior, and let's not forget that this isn't his first time in a courtroom. He has had brushes with the law in the past. It's certainly not my first time covering a case involving Conor McGregor, and he has been before the criminal courts in this country too, for relatively minor things like driving offences, but also for more serious matters like an assault in a pub in his hometown, where he was giving out free glasses of his whiskey. And a man who was sat at the bar, his local bar, and a bar he had drank in for some time, kindly refused his glass of whiskey. And when Conor McGregor persisted it on him, and he continued to refuse simply because he doesn't like whiskey, he was happy enough drinking his pint, Conor McGregor punched him. We've seen CCTV footage of that. Now, he put his hands up in relation to that, and he admitted that he was wrong, and he paid the consequences and whatnot. But counter that with Conor McGregor buying that pub, and he has been buying a lot of property in this country, particularly as his career in MMA has started to come to some sort of a conclusion, and he's been looking elsewhere at business opportunities. He bought that pub, and one of the first thing he did was announce it online and to say that your man is barred from the pub. So Conor McGregor is somebody who still has a legion of followers in this country and elsewhere. It was a bizarre situation to see, like, young men coming up to him in court looking for selfies, looking for autographs. A father bringing his son into court to shake his hand. And I think a lot of people will be looking at Conor McGregor in a very different light in respect of what happened on Friday. One thing that he certainly hasn't done is come out and apologize or shown any remorse in relation to what happened. He seems to be in totally unaccepting of the verdict of the jury. Indeed, one of the first things that he did after jumping into his Bentley and speeding off without stopping to make a statement or anything like that after the verdict came in was to take to X to announce his intention to appeal the decision. He's clearly very upset by it. And look, Conor McGregor, like any other person in these circumstances, has a right to appeal if he feels like he didn't get a fair trial. But certainly there's a lot of questions, I think, that will be asked in relation to his career in combat sports going forward. And clearly you're far better versed to speak to that. But in terms of how Conor McGregor is being perceived here in Ireland, in light of what happened, I think you need only take a curious glance at some of the commentary online to get a flavor of, I suppose, the opinions that people have of Conor McGregor. And what he did to this woman was reprehensible, completely unacceptable, obviously. And flip side of that then is, I suppose, Nikita Hand. Standing up to Conor McGregor in the octagon, I imagine, thankfully, I've never been in the position to do it and won't be in the future. but it's no easy prospect, and nor is the prospect of looking across in the arena of a courtroom in the High Court in Dublin. You know, she was very brave to bring that case against somebody like Conor McGregor, again, to see it through. Spent 3 or 4 days clearly distressed in the witness box, giving very, very difficult evidence that she would have known the whole country and indeed the whole planet would probably be tapping into. Not an easy thing for her to do, an awful lot of at stake, no guarantee of success, particularly after the DPP had decided not to pursue criminal charges. Her confidence must have been knocked in relation to that. She would have been on the hook for a pretty hefty legal bill as well. Sources tell me it could be as much as €1.5 million. And in civil cases in Ireland, the loser generally pays. So if she had lost, she would have been on the hook for that. She did lose her case against James Lawrence. So, you know, time will tell. Indeed, the court is going to sit again later in the week to decide and to adjudicate on costs in relation to that. But I think she absolutely needs to be commended, and for what she did, and for, you know, coming outside court again and afterwards and speaking to the world about her experience, and calling other survivors of sexual violence to not live in the shadows and to come forward and to share their stories, because she is proof that when you do that, you will find kind ears, you will find friendly faces, and most importantly, and this was most important for Nikita Hand and for her family and for her young daughter, most importantly in all of this was to be believed. And she is proof that when you come forward and you put your case forward, you will be believed.
Just to wrap up, you indicated that they will be back in court, I think, next week. And that, as I understand it, as you mentioned, it's related to, okay, who's going to pay these legal bills? Conor was generally the loser here. So can you just very quickly explain what we can expect when this goes back to the court to adjudicate some of those costs?
It'll be back before the court on Thursday, and Mr. Justice Alex Owens will receive submissions from both sides in terms of, I suppose, essentially how much it all cost. There were a lot of lawyers in this case, more lawyers some days than there were journalists, and there were a hell of a lot of journalists in court every day, as you can imagine. Lawyers in this country, it's the same in the United States, don't come cheap. Conor McGregor had one of the best criminal barristers in the country in Remy Farrell. This is a man who defended one of the country's most infamous and notorious killers, a man called Graham Dwyer, who was convicted of murdering a very vulnerable childcare worker called Elaine O'Hara and a number of years ago. Now, he was unsuccessful in that, and look, this is a very different arena. Clearly, that was a murder case, but he defended Mr. Dwyer. He'd be very, very well known in relation to that case and other high-profile cases in this country. He doesn't come cheap. Her side had 2 senior counsels, had a junior barrister, a number of solicitors, clearly James Lawrence as well, and this is where I suppose Nikita Hand may have to dip into her own pockets and into that compensation that Conor McGregor has been directed to pay to her, because, look, time will tell. It'll be up to the judge ultimately to adjudicate on costs, but in the ordinary way, in most cases, in civil cases, costs follow the event. So what that means essentially is that the loser pays. So while it is more straightforward in relation to the case against Conor McGregor, there may be more submissions made in relation to the case that she didn't win against James Lawrence. That will all be thrashed out in court, and the judge, who was a very, very experienced judge in these matters, he will ultimately be left to adjudicate. But also in the background, you have the potential for Conor McGregor to appeal the decision on Friday. To do that, he'll have to lodge papers with the court within a certain amount of time. And once that's done, then if that's done, a date will be set for the appeal. And I think it's important, because some people think that when it comes to appeals, again, it's not like the movies, you know, where like there's a smoking gun brought into the courtroom that will prove one person's case over the other. That's rarely happens. You know, more often than not, it's legal points, legal arguments that maybe didn't go their way that they'd be arguing the point on. He essentially will have to prove to the court that he didn't receive a fair trial, and he'll have to outline the reasons for that to be successful. But that's for another day. I think it's really important, again, that Nikita Hand is front and center in our conversations around this. And it has sparked, if there's any good to come out of all of this, as difficult as it has been for all involved. You know, I'm mindful too of Conor McGregor's family. He's got 4 kids. listening to all of this. It's not easy for either party. But like the one kind of shred of positivity to come out of it all is that like really important conversations are being had in relation to consent, in relation to sexual activity, in relation to sexual violence. On the face of it, I think you'll agree that like for most reasonable minded people, the issue of consent is a fairly straightforward one. You either want to do something or you don't. You either give somebody permission to do something or you don't. But in my experience involving cases of sexual violence, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more nuance in relation to that. And I think it's really important that those conversations are had, particularly for young men who may be embarking on their own sexual journeys for the first time. Looking into and tapping into these conversations is really, really important, not just for young men, but also for young women. And clearly, sexual violence isn't just isolated to women. There are many men that come before the courts as well, making allegations of sexual violence. So, it's been a very difficult couple of weeks for all involved. Nikita Hand in particular, obviously, not only has it been a difficult few weeks for her, it's been a very, very difficult 6 years for her, because this has been dragged on and on. It has been adjourned on a number of occasions. The last adjournment was during the summer to allow Conor McGregor prepare for a fight that he ultimately didn't end up competing in because he broke his toe in training. We all know the circumstances around that. But in the background while all that was going on was Nikita Hand going to bed every night, worrying about it, stressing about it, wondering if she would be believed. And she would be very grateful and thankful that when the jury came back, having deliberated again for just over 6 hours, they found in her favor. They found her version of events to be more probable than Conor McGregor's. They believed her.
So let's wrap on this, and I so greatly appreciate your time and wisdom. Just one thing I would like to address, and I would love to get your perspective, this notion that this was some kind of, you kind of addressed it earlier, that there have been some pushback by supporters of McGregor suggesting that what Hand did was a money grab. But in the end, she didn't get much. She knew she wouldn't get much. She knew that there was a risk that she would, in fact, have to pay his legal bills in the event that this went south for her chances. And then she pursued this over the course, as you indicated, for 6 years. None of these things by themselves are dispositive, but as a composite picture, it just seems so unlikely that anyone would even attempt something like this. And then again, the re-traumatization through this process, if this was strictly a function of money, if it was just a money grab, this seems like an awfully huge cost to pay to your personhood in order to get there. I'm kind of asserting an opinion and asking you to weigh in on it, but I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, clearly, that wouldn't have been a feature of the jury's deliberations. But it is something that I think you can take into account, that, would somebody have put themselves through this nightmare? And it has been a nightmare for her over the past 6 years. We've heard about her having to leave her home. We've heard about the strain that it put on the relationship that she had at the time with a man. That relationship ended maybe 6 months or so later. We've heard about the devastating impact it has had on her career, on her livelihood, on her relationship with men. And thankfully she has met somebody else, and that partner was with her in court throughout, holding her hand tightly, a very strong support. And let's not forget about him in all of this either. This has been a very difficult experience for him too, to hear some of the details that were being, and through my reportage and through the reportage that you would see in the newspapers and elsewhere, people at home are really only getting the tip of the iceberg. It goes into, the jurors are told a lot more graphic detail in relation to specifically the injuries and the sexual violence itself that you couldn't possibly put out in the public domain for taste and decency reasons. But he was sitting there in the public gallery listening to all that. Clearly a very distressing experience for him. If, as Conor McGregor's side alleged, that this was all about money, well then Nikita Hand, you would have to say, has the biggest cojones going, because the consequences for her losing this case were astronomical in terms of her reputation, and in terms of her pocket, and in terms of, she's 35 years of age, in terms of how she lives the rest of her life. So, you'd have to ask yourself, would somebody who was just in this for the money having gone through that bitter disappointment of the DPP not bringing those criminal charges, would they have walked away at that point, or would they have kept going in the face of an enormous challenge with no guarantee of success? Would somebody have put them through all of that if it was just for the money? If you look at the statement, the impassioned and the emotional statement that she made outside court after the jury ruled in her favor, was that somebody that was in it for the money? When she speaks about doing it for her daughter, when she speaks about doing it for other survivors of sexual violence, many of whom, the majority of whom we know do not come forward for all of the reasons that I have outlined. These types of cases, certainly in the criminal sphere, do not have a good rate of conviction because they're very, very difficult cases to prosecute. And that's something that the DPP would obviously have taken into account. So with all of that in mind, Nikita Hand kept going. She kept seeking out that vindication. She was hyperventilating. She was struggling to find her breath when she walked past Conor McGregor to take her seat in the witness box to begin what can only be described as a grueling 3 or 4 days in the witness box, giving her direct evidence, being cross-examined by all the barristers about the minute details of her evidence. Her character was called into question. Her intentions were called into question. This was all laid bare for family and friends to see, and she still kept going. And I think, you've asked a really good question. Are those the actions of somebody who is in just for the money? Personally, in my opinion, I don't think so. And I think the jurors, in light of their decision on Friday, felt that she was telling the truth and that her story, again, was more probable than Conor McGregor's. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
I think that's a good place to wrap. Frank, if people want more of your work, where can they find it?
Well, they can find me personally on X at Frank Greaney, and also I work for Newstalk on our social media pages. I also contributed to a podcast for the Irish Times. The Irish Times is a broadsheet national newspaper here in Ireland, the paper of record, as we like to call it. And we've done a very detailed podcast that goes through the trial from start to finish and gives my thought in the immediate aftermath of the verdict coming in last Friday, and that's available, anywhere you find your podcasts.
Frank Greaney, thank you so much.
Thanks, Luke. Good chatting to you.